Hello and welcome to the RICS World Built Environment Forum webinar. Today, the session is in partnership with HKA and the discussion will be on operating in uncertain times, focusing mainly on Middle East construction and how the industry can adapt to a new normal. Today's webinar is in partnership with HKA, who's the lead tech partner. Myself, Anas Batar, the Director of Center of Excellence in Smart Construction, and I'll be chairing today's webinar, and I'll be introducing a number of esteemed panel members in a few minutes. But first, I'd like to take you through the backbone of what we're going to be talking about today, which is mainly the Insight report that was recently published by HKA. Just to give you a bit of an overview of this report. The report was reporting a study that was done across the globe, mainly around the challenges that we have in the construction industry in terms of claims and disputes. The results that we've seen within the report have highlighted an issue that it's pretty much known within the construction industry, but the numbers were quite worrying. The challenges that we have within the construction industry were highlighted. There was a number of projects that were studied, more than 1,400 projects around the globe. The report looked at 6 different global regions across 94 countries, where the data was collected from 2017 to 2021. The projects that we looked at were a total of $2 trillion capex, where there was a number of claims of extension of time, mainly of around 750 years of extension from these projects, which is, again, it's quite worrying, with a total cost claimed of nearly $73 billion. The root causes that were highlighted in this report, this is globally, mainly to do with change in scope. The change in scope was something that was highlighted quite a lot across every single project, and this gives you the impression of the fact that the process that we have within the construction industry allows the change in scopes to happen, whether during the design phase or even the construction phase, which has a bigger impact. And this has been one of the biggest root causes. But also there was other causes such as the conflicting of interpretation of the contracts. Again, that's another challenge that we have and we've seen across the globe. Design failures is another issue. Again, this is sometimes, or most of the time, nothing to do with the capability of the design consultant themselves, but it's just because some misinterpretation of client requirements, scope changes, and etc. that does result in design failure. And last but not least, one of the main root causes for the challenges that we have in disputes and delays in projects is the mismanagement of subcontractors. We will drill down on these root causes a bit more with our panel members. Uncertain times were one of the main challenges that we looked at. Now, in terms of the highlights, the report, it identifies a series of factors that contribute to the commercial uncertain times or uncertainty. We do live in uncertain times, mainly to do with COVID-19. But also the shortage of skills and material. And we see this mainly when there is a complex project or new initiatives that's been implemented on a certain project, whether it's the digitization, whether it's modern methods of construction or new technologies that could be brought into a project, and we see a big shortage never the fact that we also have shortages in hard skills as well. It's we also what contributes to uncertainty, especially from a commercial perspective, is the inconsistent adoption of technology. Again, we'll touch upon this a little bit more, but technology keeps developing, and we keep seeing inconsistency between different projects and different clients, and etc. And that leaves an uncertain environment for the construction industry. The political drive, or the political drivers, again, we'll see across the globe changes in power, or changes in policies does have the impact on our construction projects, especially those that are 10, 20, 15 years, or even 5-year programs. It might have an impact on that, whether it's to do with policy changes or coding compliance, or even the shift of the mindset and the strategies of the governments and organizations. And last but not least is obviously the sustainability and climate change, or climate concern. This has been identified as one of the challenges that has brought in some uncertain issues that needs to be considered within the commercial aspects, and this has brought in a lot of challenges within the construction industry. Although the drive for sustainability now is a positive thing, it's changing. However, it needs to be addressed in the right way. It needs to be addressed in the right financial way, but also in the right contractual manner, to make sure that we achieve the right deliverables and right requirements when it comes to sustainability. However, there is possibilities of just without, we can't just identify the challenges and not identify the opportunities. Obviously, there's a number of opportunities that were highlighted. These were a selection of measures designed to combat the causes of uncertainties. First of all, there is a highlight within the report in terms of how can we achieve better control of the uncertainties through improved liquidity, effective collaboration. Collaboration was highlighted throughout the report as one of the main pillars to not only to manage the uncertainties, but also to move on to other improvements as well. Harnessing data. We live in a data era, we live in a digital era, so there's a lot of data that's been collected. Now within the construction industry, we are moving towards the digital transformation, and there's a lot of data that's being collected digitally, and it's important that we harness this data to make decisions in the right way, and maybe predict in some cases certain things. Management of the supply chain, that has proven to be one of the measures to consider. Again, this is through obviously a number of case studies and pilot projects across the globe. Within the report, it was highlighted that managing the supply chain can affect or have a positive effect in certain times. And last but not least, investing in talent, especially within the new generation, where they can not only bring in new blood to the industry, but also bring new thinking and new way of working as well. I think there's a bit of a delay in the slides. So that was the globe, and the report does focus on the Middle East, and hence we're in the Middle East. We thought we'll give you a bit of a background about the Middle East itself. It does touch on similar things. And there was a separate section within the report that talks about Middle East in specifically, mainly the fact that the projects face the longest time overruns of any region within the Middle East region. Again, that's because of a number of challenges that were identified in the report, but there was a number of studies that was done for the report, which concluded an equivalent of an average of 84.7 or round up to 85% of schedules being overrun, and that's quite an eye-watering figure. There has been a number of ways to address this challenge by having early contractors' involvement in the design development, alignment with robust scheduling, and employer stress tests of buildability. These are the different involvements or early contract involvements that were brought in or utilized in the Middle East to address some of these challenges. The report has identified a number of projects, precisely 329 projects across the Middle East, across the 12 countries, where the average capex value of the projects were $1.98 billion. And again, some really eye-watering figures here. The report showcased that there was an average of extension of time claimed of 84.7%, with an average cost claimed of $134 million. Again, if you compare that to the global, it might not be the cost claims, it might not be the highest, but certainly the extension of time claimed is the highest across regions. Again, there was a number of deep dive in terms of the causes of these claims and the disputes in the Middle East. Again, change in scope was one of the highest ones that were highlighted. However, there was a detailed report or study between the different countries within the Middle East, but change in scope was always shows as the highest. Design information has been highlighted as being issued late in comparison to other regions. And this has a number of factors, mainly to do with the process that we have here, and certainly some contract as well, that has an impact on the design stages and the information of the design to be issued. And again, the type of contract itself does have a big impact on this, whether it's design and build or design bid and build. So there's obviously that has an impact on the design information to be issued at certain stages within the project. The contracts were also looked at. The interpretation of the contracts were highlighted as one of the causes of these claims, and there was a need to come together to have a clear interpretation of contracts and a clear process of rectifying these miscommunications or misinterpretations. Incompletion of design was, again, one of the things that were highlighted quite a lot. Globally, it wasn't so much, but I think in the region, this challenge was highlighted as one of the main causes. This is, again, linked to some extent the contracts and agreements that we have in place. Last but not least, the contract management itself and administration failure was one of the challenges that were identified and the cause of the claims and disputes that we have within the Middle East. As you can see, mainly to do with contracts and design and change of scope. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panels of today. Within the panel discussion, we'll discuss a number of the challenges and the report outcomes, but also dwell further from that. I'd like to welcome Irina, Senior Consultant from HKA, Amanda Clark, Head of Strategic Advisory and Head of Public Sector in CBRE, Slava, Partner and Global Head of Energy within DWF, Middle East, and last but not least, Haroon, Partner and Head of Middle East within HKA. Thank you all for joining me today. I think we all agree that the report was certainly eye-watering, and there was a number of issues that really need to be addressed. The report does share a lot of light on certain issues, and especially globally, but also mainly within the Middle East. And hopefully that will give us some insight that we can discuss today. Moving on, I think we have a number of questions that came out of this report that I'd like to ask yourselves to describe them or to discuss them between us, and hopefully share some further insight about the report, but also your expertise within the industries. So the first question that we have, apologies about the delay in the slides. So the first question that we have is, how have the construction projects fared in the Middle East during COVID-19? This question I'd like to maybe to start with you, Haroon. You're a chartered surveyor, and you've been involved in the Middle East for some time, and you've heavily been involved in obviously the construction projects, and obviously lived with us during the COVID-19, and have been involved in some of the issues and challenges. If you could please just let us know from the report, but also from your experience and involvement, how did the construction projects in the Middle East fared during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Thanks a lot, Anas. It's actually quite a difficult question for me to answer, and the reason I find this question slightly difficult is because, I mean, COVID has been spoken about extensively. Every webinar, every article, every news bulletin, website, and I'm sure a number of those on this call are frankly sick and tired of COVID. But the real challenge I faced is that COVID has touched each and every one of us differently in our personal and professional lives, and it's very easy to lose sight of that when you're talking business as such. And I think the context of this question really needs to consider, yes, the construction industry, but each and every one of us who have some sort of role in the built environment. How did we deal with the consequences of COVID? Whether that was working at home with children, trying to deliver Museum of the Future in Dubai, or getting a project off the ground in Saudi. So keeping that context in mind, I would say the number one issue was uncertainty. Uncertainty as to, would I have a job to go to? Would the project continue? Is it safe for me to go to work or not? And if it is safe, what other challenges am I going to face to enable me to even do my work? I think one thing we can safely say, and I think we're pretty fortunate to be in the Middle East. Amanda's not in the Middle East, and a number of those on the call are not in the Middle East. But the Middle East industry, construction industry, definitely showed resilience. It showed resilience in terms of pressing forward with construction projects. And amidst the uncertainty, very quickly, governments in each of the key countries in particular put processes in place, procedures in place, controls in place, allowing construction to continue. And I think if we look back now 2 years on, and really we have to learn from what we've experienced in the last 2 years, and we just look at some of the achievements. As I mentioned just yesterday, Museum of the Future was launched. That was a project that continued through COVID. In Saudi, we saw mega projects such as KAFD continuing on site. We've seen Riyadh Metro continuing on site. In Qatar, we've seen the stadia work continuing, Doha Metro continuing as they get ready for the World Cup later in this year. And obviously one cannot forget the huge achievement in delivering the Expo site here in the UAE. So I think if you just consider these flagship projects, that really gives a feel for how construction has fared here in the Middle East. Now, for each and every job that has been able to reach some sort of completion, there are numerous that haven't. Let's be clear, and huge challenges around uncertainty with supply chain, with contract management issues, which were really exacerbated due to COVID. I mean, I remember one of the first bits of a dispute that we actually had to look at, and I think Slava will probably be better placed looking and testing, talking to unreasonableness, was a contract which was signed in January 2020. So just in the beginning of COVID, when we all thought this is just going to blow over in a few weeks. Come June 2020, the engineer was writing to the contractor for this contract signed in January 2020 saying, well, COVID was entirely foreseeable. We knew this pandemic was coming. Whether that's what the unreasonableness clause in the force majeure, unreasonable element of the force majeure clause means, I think Slava will be better placed to address that later on. But it talks to a number of issues. For me, it's not the engineer giving that response. It's the challenges around contract management, around behavior, around culture, which all had an impact during, I don't want to say during COVID because we're still in COVID, but during the last 2 years, Anas.
That's very interesting. Thanks, Harun. I think it's the dispute and whether you would class COVID as an uncertain time or not. That's a very interesting one. Which in the report shows that COVID was one of the uncertainties that added into the other major uncertainties that we have within the industry. Thanks for that, Aaron. Turning to Irina, I think that we have almost a follow-up question in terms of, and you've got a unique background. You're an engineer, but you also you've worked in project management and engineering and etc. But also you obviously work on contracts and disputes within the Middle East. Has the pandemic changed the frequency of and the nature of the disputes that occur within the Middle East, in specifically?
Thank you, Anas. First of all, I hope everyone can hear me well. Pleasure to be here. It's a wonderful company to be in, and thank you for everyone who joined us online. Look, I think I just want to focus a little bit more on the Middle East study, or part of the CRUX study that we are doing. And I think both yourself, Anas, and Harun has given already a very good introduction to the problem overall. So in terms of the part of the study, we obviously looked, as you said, at some 329 projects across 12 countries. And I think the major takeaway there is that the top 5 causes are not actually dissimilar to the global trend. So what we are constantly seeing again and again is that the change in scope is the #1, the top causation factor there. Now, there is some differences in terms of ranking between the global sort of trend and the Middle East trend. So let's say the late design is #2 in terms of causation for the Middle East, but it's #4 globally. So again, consistency with same problem occurring in the Middle East, where perhaps projects go to tender, they are not ready fully for execution. So incomplete designs is still very much an issue, and I think we still look at changing that sort of mindset, rushing into executing, rushing into sites. We need to give a bit more time in terms of maturity of design and things like that. And generally speaking, you think about change in scope. Change happens. It's only normal. I think it's the way how parties deal with change, and being the top causation factor globally and in the Middle East, it just tells us that perhaps parties are not prepared to deal with the change the way they ought to have been. And again, it's change in mindset, whether employers are ready to accept entitlements that are legitimate entitlements. Again, Slava perhaps would have a better view on this, but that's something to still very much to be considered by everyone in the construction sector. Now, the other interesting thing is that, the slides, please. Since we are talking about COVID-19 a little bit, what we have found, in fact, is that I hope that everyone can see the font is quite small, but the COVID-19 is actually at the very bottom of this list here. So what it tells us, Yes, of course, we know that COVID has impacted construction. It's impacted everything, just like Harun said, every aspect of our lives, whether professional or personal. But perhaps a standalone factor, if you isolate it from others, it has really given that sort of critical impact that many contractors would otherwise hope for. We're constantly dealing with claims, either helping contractors to prepare claims or looking at reviewing claims. And what we are seeing is that the criticality of the COVID-19 as a standalone is not nearly there as maybe with some other factors or delay events or disruption events. So again, it's the level of impact that if you strip out all other events, you would find perhaps that COVID-19 alone has not really contributed to the either completion or disruption or what have you. The other interesting finding I would mention is that analyzed top 10 causation factors pre-COVID and post-COVID. And what we have found, at least for the Middle East, is that restricted access to site and to workforce was actually number 5 pre-COVID and did not feature in the top 10 causation factors post-COVID, which again, Harun already mentioned, tells us that perhaps the willingness of the governments here in the region, regulatory bodies here, to let construction to continue as much as possible, that perhaps played a role. Contractors were able to continue to a certain extent, unlike in some other regions where often you would find that project completely stopped and any sort of activity was non-existent on site. So that's perhaps the one more interesting finding I wanted to mention. Now, late approvals, cash flow issues, lack of liquidity is still very much prevalent in the Middle East. But I don't want to sort of focus too much about it, because if you go to our CRUX webpage on our website, the dashboard is very user-friendly, the platform is very user-friendly, so you would be able to kind of play with it and for yourselves find information per region, per sector, different types of contracts, etc. So it's all there. But what I talk about a little bit more is the top 4 sectors that we looked at. On the next slide, you would see that in the Middle East anyway, it's resources, infrastructure, and that's mainly transportation projects and power and utilities. And again, actually the top 5 causes amongst these 4 sectors are not really that dissimilar. There are differences there, but perhaps more similarities than differences. So again, changes scope is by far number 1. Late design information, again, it is, I think, featuring in 3 out of 4. So again, late design approvals, issues with contract interpretation, and things like that. Now, the one thing that stands out here, as you would see, that for the building sector, the cash flow and payment issues are featuring in the top 5, unlike in the other 3 sectors. And when I think about that, perhaps has to do with some of them being privately funded rather than funded by governments here, and maybe have been put on the sort of backseat when there were issues with liquidity, generally speaking, economic downturn and pandemic. Access to site, featuring in a couple of them, well, resources, infrastructure, and power. And again, perhaps has to do with where exactly those projects have been executed. And if we talk about, for example, UAE, I think there's been a lot more relaxation than maybe in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere in the region in terms of access to site. So that's on the, and on the next slide, again, you would see that actually COVID-19, again, is at the very bottom of the list there. And in fact, does not feature at all in infrastructure list. So it just tells you that, yes, we all know we've been affected as an industry, but perhaps not to the extent, and there are still other factors that are much more stronger at play. The last thing that I wanted to focus on is in terms of the 3 top countries that we looked at. So we looked at UAE, obviously, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And as you can see, change in scope is the #1 cause for disputes. And between the UAE, I would say, and Qatar, there is a lot of similarities there. So late design, incomplete design, and things like that. Again, as you would see, contract interpretation issues and management, contract management issues, as you mentioned, Anas, in your introduction, that's very much still a problematic area. And in Saudi, you would see that cash flow is #2 in the list, and access to site is #3. Again, perhaps in terms of access, has to do a lot with the restrictions that government introduced in terms of contractors being able to access sites and continue with the execution. So that's mainly what we are seeing and the conclusion of the study in terms of Middle East. Were there more disputes than before COVID? I think the trend is that there's plenty of disputes out there, whether or not they're all, necessarily the result of COVID-19. I think, as we all can see, perhaps not always the case.
Thank you, Irina. That's very interesting, especially the slide that you mentioned, the direct implication of COVID into claims. It's not there, but perhaps I think we'll touch on this in the follow-up questions. It's the indirect impact of COVID on claims and disputes. I think that might be something that I would bring in Slava for. Slava, with your background as a solicitor, do you reckon the pandemic has led to an increase or a reduction in the willingness of different parties to resolving the disputes in less adversarial ways? I.e., if again, this is one of the indirect impacts of COVID, isn't it? And what do you think? Has it increased it or reduced it?
Thanks, Anas. That's actually a really interesting question in the way that it's framed, because, and I know where Harun and Irina are coming from in terms of COVID hasn't been the direct impact or cause of claims. However, I would say, perhaps controversially, is that it's been the biggest scapegoat for settling claims as well. And in order to fully digest that, if you're not coming from the Middle East region, this is a region of litigation to a large extent, where parties would commence disputes and then seek to settle them as soon as possible. Now, with COVID at play, what has actually happened is that parties on the receiving end of the claims have now had a reason to settle them more quickly and more understandably. And that is also to do with the mentality of certain employers or public bodies, where effectively it is easier to have a judgment against you than it is to sign a settlement, because you're less perceived to be as auditable, shall we say. If you are taking a decision and you sign your name off on a settlement, that is you taking a decision, for better or for worse. Somebody could come in and question it later. If it is a judge or 3 wise individuals in an arbitral tribunal, that is somebody else taking a decision. And that hasn't always been understood by contractors or those operating in the Middle East. Now, what COVID actually did is that it increased the tension between the parties, because obviously we have cash flow constraints, we have different kind of issues that were arising and uncertain times. And like Harun mentioned earlier, by June, we would have been seeing notices, reasonable or unreasonable. I'll reserve my position on that. But come September or November of the same year, we would have seen a lot more employers actually saying, you know what, COVID is a good enough reason to grant an EOT, because, well, there is impact. We could see that there's impact. So let's just blame it on COVID and move on with the project. Because realistically, that is what everybody wants to do. They don't want to be stuck in disputes. They want to be continuing and building their projects. And I think that is a peculiarity of the Middle East and perhaps some of the jurisdictions in the Asia region. Having said that, what I've seen across other regions, in particular in Europe and in LATAM, is that COVID and not being a contentious issue, it actually galvanized the parties to work together, because people and employers and contractors and subbies, they all found themselves in one boat. Everybody was unsure as to what is going to happen next, which meant that it was far easier to agree on what is going to happen next than to see it out and perhaps reach a result which you don't want, whether it will impact the completion of your project, the price of your project, or even your relationship with your contracting entities. So to sum up and to go back to the question, has it led an increase or reduction? Well, yes, there has been an increase in settlements, I would say. Has there really been an increase in resolving disputes in less adversarial ways? Probably not. In fact, one of the strategies that has been adopted by a lot of industry players is that you do go into litigation. So you take a very aggressive stance at the end, you will commence proceedings. Perhaps you will have a statement of claim and an arbitration being filed, after which there is a desperate dash to settlement to ensure that actually you're not leaving the decision in someone else's hands, you're agreeing it with the other side. And it has always been helpful from my side to see the independent expert evidence being filed, as it allows the party to really understand what is being put against them and how valid it is. And we all know that sometimes when claims come in, they basically get filed to the bottom of the pile, maybe reviewed, maybe negotiated. But ultimately, until there is formal proceedings with a court or arbitration or anything else, only then does it get escalated to the top echelons of power who are there to make the decisions. And with COVID, it has actually been quite refreshing. From our side of the fence, we have seen far less final hearings because there's a lot more settlement that is being done and parties are really focusing on what the real issues are. And the employers in the region are also cognizant they cannot be too unreasonable in a time where effectively the entire world is suffering some form of delay or inconvenience that has been caused by the pandemic. They do have a slightly longer term view than they did, say, 5 years ago. And that has been a breath of fresh air. In terms of anecdotal evidence as to how COVID has impacted, I think I've seen it pleaded in almost every single claim that came across my desk. Now, whether it was the actual cause of the delay, I doubt it. I very much doubt it, because it was just an easy thing to add. It was well understood. You don't really have to convince anyone that it had some impact, whether that was critical impact or whether it actually gave rise to the cost that one is claiming. Well, that is to be decided or hopefully settled. So in my opinion, in summary, from what I've seen is that there hasn't been a change to the start of the process, but there certainly has been an increase in parties trying to sit around the table and work out a way to deal with things together, as opposed to leaving the decision in other people's hands.
Interesting take on that particular topic, because there's a lot of assumptions that COVID will make things worse and make more challenges, but also delay the disputes and etc. And I guess there's a pros and cons for every situation. A little bit away from COVID and maybe away from disputes, or at least the legal aspect of disputes. I'll turn to you, Amanda, with your vast experience in real estate and construction industry and infrastructure. What do you think is the steps that construction companies can take to minimize the risk of disputes during these uncertain times? I'm not just talking about COVID uncertain times, but any of the uncertain times that we've described earlier.
Brilliant, thank you, Anas, and really great to be here and talking on this subject. I'd like to sort of pick up on actually what Slava was saying, which I think is an important place to start, which is I think actually we need to sort of focus on some of the positives that have changed over the last couple of years, and actually think about What does that mean in terms of perhaps how we look to minimise risks on disputes going forwards? And in particular, I think, one of the things has been greater collaboration across the supply chain, a greater collaboration with the clients. This more kind of let's kind of crack on with it. We understand there's issues. Let's not kind of get to the courtroom in terms of fighting the disputes. And I think all of that points to a better working environment, and I think that's actually something we should take forwards into our new world as we kind of like emerge from all of this. But I really liked one of the quotes that's in the Crux report, and it talks about the structural fault line, which is kind of inherent, I think, in kind of like our sector, which is it's an underlying cause that basically we have high risk and low margin, and if you couple that with uncertain times, you're going to kind of end up in more of a adverse and dispute oriented environment. And the key is, what do we do about it? And I think, kind of focusing on sort of some of the causes that you talked about, Anas and Iriana as well, around, I think they're kind of well articulated, but of course it's now what do we do about it in terms of how do we take this forward? So you kind of look at the change of scope. What does that mean? Well, it's about getting it right ahead of construction. What does that mean? Well, it's about getting your contractor involved earlier in the process. So early contractor involvement is a responsibility of the client and the design team as much as it is of the contractor. So how can we enable that, and how can we make that happen so that you're ironing out the issues early on? How can we kind of be thinking about the scope change in collaboration and discussing that openly and understanding what the cause and effect is of those scope changes, so that actually before they're given the green light, everybody understands what the implications are in terms of how you take that forwards. The second cause globally was around this contractual interpretation issues. Well, again, that points to me about getting involved in schemes early, influencing design, taking the contract, taking into account what it means to actually undertake this contract, and particularly around the constraints, and really understanding, I think, also risk allocation and ownership, so that, again, client and contractor design team are all really understanding what the risks are and who's kind of accountable for those risks in terms of how you take it forward. I think, the late design piece, again, has sort of been emphasised as kind of like one of the key points. And I think there's cause 4, 5 and 6 on the global list actually points to some element of design, kind of being in there. And for me, I think that kind of comes on to perhaps what we'll touch on in a moment, which is how can technology help, and how can you use BIM technologies in particular to really iron out those design issues ahead. So actually contractors getting up the learning curve quickly and embracing those technologies, I think is going to be really important. I do think actually there's a client responsibility in all of this as well, and what we want is intelligent clients and good clienting, whether that's the client themselves, so i.e. the person that writes the check, or whether it's actually the main contractor, and as they start to look down into the supply chain, how they too can be the good clients. And that's about paying people on time, making sure that you're oiling the wheels through the process to again avoid the need for disputes. And also, clients quite often have very unrealistic expectations around tender periods. So how can we make sure that we educate our clients to investing, if you like, into the tender period, so that you're again avoiding that dispute down the line? So for me, it's very much this handshake between client, designer and the contractor and the supply chain, all really coming together to collaborate and focus on getting things done. That's really key. And we have to, of course, I have to mention this, it's one of the things I'm really passionate about, which is investing in talent. So getting good people engaged in our sector is invariably going to help. And I think actually for construction companies, having top talent within is really important as well. So I think there's a lot we can do, Anas, in terms of what we need to be doing. going forwards, and a lot of lessons. But actually, a lot of this isn't new, but perhaps we can use the pandemic as a way of emerging out of this stronger.
Absolutely. We see that with technologies in the construction industry, whether it's digital technologies or even technologies such as modern methods of construction, modular construction, etc., that's being used to change our process and procedures. And that leads me to the next question, and I'll drag you into this arena. How do you see these kind of technologies? Amanda, I've mentioned BIM, and there's many other technologies out there as well. How can these kind of technologies reduce or help us reduce the likelihood of disputes within the construction industry?
I think that's $1 million question, Anas, the how. I think there is no doubt that it can help. Whether or not, as an industry, as a sector, we are prepared to fully embrace technology, I think that's a big question. And perhaps not without a reason. I think there are challenges, there are legitimate challenges, I would say, which I'm going to talk about. But for me, it's always kind of, it's going to be almost a perfect storm, or I call it organized chaos. So it will get worse until I think it gets better. And I think, as with everything new in life that as a humanity we start to use, whether in construction or elsewhere, there's that learning curve there. And while we are getting ourselves familiar with these new things, and it almost becomes a norm, it takes time to get there. And whether or not immediately overnight, we just get a specific tool, technology tool, and start using it, and it's going to solve all the problems miraculously, I don't think that's going to be the case. Perhaps it will actually result in further disputes around the use of technology itself, rather than immediately helping us with either reducing the disputes or at least solving them more efficiently. So it's going to take a bit more time. And I mentioned, there are challenges, and I think there are real challenges. First of all, construction as a sector, as an industry, is there are many players out there. So we are talking about huge, supply chains, subcontractors, suppliers, smaller entities. And if you look at a specific project, a given project, and you have, I don't know, 10 stakeholders on a project, and 5 consultants, and let's say 5 entities during execution stage, and just 1 consultant out of 5 is using digital twins or BIM, which is at least 4D, forget about even 5D, and the rest is not, that's already a challenge there. So first of all, it's getting to the stage where everyone is ready, equally ready to embrace technology, take these risks, and get on with it. Because right now we're not yet there. The other thing is technology on itself requires a lot of investment and funding. And as I said, if you are talking about bigger contracting entities, perhaps they're more willing to invest into technology and wait a bit, give it time, because it is a long game you're going to be in until you actually can see the real benefits. But smaller entities, it's just more difficult for them. So, they want to see the sort of return on investment as quickly as possible, and they don't have the patience to stay in the game for a longer run. And that's unfortunately the case. And the other thing is regulation and legislation framework around the use of technology. And I'll give you an example, use of drones, for example. By any means not a new technology. It's been used on sites for some time, and I think the scope of application of such things is quite wide. Not least, accessing maybe remote locations on sites, specifically where you have vast areas such as in pipeline projects, for example. So there is safety aspect in it. There is the monitoring aspect of it, taking obviously photos and things like that. So I think that the benefit is known. But for example, in the UAE, after recent issues that we've had, drones are not really used, or can be used at this point in time. So again, its regulations is how contractors are able to actually use a specific technology. Or for example, you know, as I said, digital twins and BIM, many people still use spreadsheets. You know, many smaller suppliers, smaller entities even work with spreadsheets. We can't even talk about, you know, 4D, 5D, forget about it. Not many use 3D even at this day and age. So again, it's application of these things across the board. And if it's not done this way, then obviously it's kind of, you know, obsolete effort, if I may.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The other things is, for example, if you talk about AI sort of based solutions or cloud-based solutions, again, it's have to use it across the board. All the stakeholders have to be feeding into this. And I think, again, the benefit is obvious to everyone. Is saving time, it's saving cost in terms of dealing with perhaps, you know, RFIs, claims, engineer instructions and things like that. So again, it boosts productivity in that aspect, but the issues remain with accuracy of data, you know, usage of different sort of platforms and softwares that, you know, used by different stakeholders in a project and feeding into the either twin or whatever you call it, digital model. So there are things like that which eventually we will overcome, but today they still remain, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
Example of robotics, again, is not entirely new. They've been used for some time on sites with specific tasks, I would say, particularly. But again, can be expensive, so investment is high, and whether or not you know, everyone is ready to embrace it today, I think it still needs a bit more time. And you know, if you compare, for example, construction sector with manufacturing, we are so far away from, let's say, using robotics or running autonomous sites. I think it's something that we might only see in the future.
We saw that within the report. Actually, the technology or digital transformation was highlighted as a benefit or something as seen as a good thing that we can utilize, but also as a risk. We've seen it as a risk in terms of the inconsistency of adoption. That was one of the challenges I brought in, but also the benefit of harnessing the data and utilizing that data that we collect from the examples that you gave, which is robots and digital twinning and drones and etc. But we're still not there yet, which actually brings more disputes, I think, to the table. I'm aware of the time, but we've got some. I think this topic itself we will probably spend more than 2 hours on. Never mind just an hour. But I've got a few more questions I'd like to ask the panel. I'll turn to you, Haroon. The question that we have, and maybe in a few sentences, if that's possible, I would like to ask you, what knock-on effects could the pandemic have on future construction projects? You're on mute.
And the famous "you're on mute." Very simply, I'll keep it short. There's going to be more disputes. Using Slava's phrase of the scapegoat of COVID, that scapegoat will soon go away, and the underlying issues that we've spoken about at length, changing scope, late design, contract management, will remain. Add that little bit of mix with a bit of COVID, and that's your recipe for greater disputes. And I think there's a lot more disputes to come. I would add one knock-on effect very quickly that I would like to see. Slava used the phrase galvanized, Amanda used the phrase the handshake. We lost our civil liberties during COVID. Human beings were brought back to nature, let's say, brought back to basics. Collaboration and culture. Add 2 more C's to cash flow. So King is not only cash flow, it's also collaboration and culture, delivering solutions as humans.
Absolutely. You've used your minutes wisely with these words. Slava, I'll turn to you with because you were brought into that question. Is the new norm likely for construction, or do you think business will be back to usual?
Define the new normal. as we sit today, because last month it was something else, a year ago it was something completely different. I think Harun is right. He said that you cannot no longer blame COVID, or very soon you can't. You can't anymore. That's it. Full stop. You'll get no sympathy for any claim coming out of the end of 2011, beginning of 2020, and trying to blame COVID on it. It's not going to happen. No one will give you that sympathy. Most of the force majeure clauses have been amended. Everybody's alive to the issues, and those disputes which did have a, shall we say, COVID flavor have now either been progressed or settled. So will it affect and have an increase or prevalence of disputes? No, it will probably remain the same as it is, and the new normal has just become the normal. It's no longer new, it's what we live in, and soon enough we'll probably be talking about the new normal of not wearing face masks as opposed to having them. And I can only hope that the PCR test providers suffer a bit of the pain that we all have in terms of cash flow issues, because if that was a business, then that would be a very successful one these days.
Yeah,
so I'll leave some time as well. I'm mindful of the time here.
Thank you. No, absolutely. You've highlighted a very good point, which is we need to know what is the new normal, and things do change, whether it's arguably to do with COVID or to do with other stuff, maybe related or not. That's a question that we will only wait to see. Amanda, with the last question, but it's a very interesting one. How best can the construction industry work together to create a healthier and more collaborative contracting environment?
Well, I'd like to take Harun's 3 C's and add a 4th, because I think it is all about cash flow, collaboration, culture, but I'd just like to add clienting in there, because I think that's just so key to it. But in terms of collaboration, I think collaboration to enhance that productivity, leveraged by good data. We haven't really sort of touched on data and the importance of it, but that's harnessing the power of good data to make informed decision making, I think, is really key. And managing and improving liquidity throughout it all, managing suppliers proactively, investing in talent. But I think really, you know, Iriana's point around technology, you know, BIM and digital twin, let's really use that as a tool to collaborate and work together to help solve the issues. Let's work with our clients, reasonable tender periods, early contractor involvement, pay on time. It's the simple things that are going to make the biggest difference here. And look at where we can share costs, I think especially in terms of additional labour, especially in terms of additional costs around people's travel at the moment. So yeah, it's, for me, it's, if you've got one word, 1 C, it's collaboration, but I think the 4 C's. Thank you.
Thank you. I was going to ask if we had time for a word to take away, but I think we've got the 4 C's, which is brilliant. Well, that brings us to the end of the today's session. I'd like to thank you all for your participation. I'd like to thank all the audience for listening in and dropping in some questions. I'd like to remind everyone that we will have a publication, or the recording of this webinar will be published along with a written summary, as well as the presentation will be shared online as well. Please do join us for the future webinars. The next slide will show us some of the webinars that's planned as part of the World Summit Forum. And I'd like to thank you all for your participation. If anyone has any question from the audience, I'm sure they will reach out to the team. So please feel free to do so. I hope you found this beneficial and fruitful as much as I did, and look forward to future webinars. Thank you very much.